Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics. Hi, Rupert. How are you doing today?
Great, thanks.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
Paul, welcome. So, today we are very excited to have guests in our podcast today. Paul Tolchinsky is joining us from Arizona. And Paul, welcome to our podcast. We are very much looking forward to have you and listen to your experiences. But before we dive into the work of your lifetime, we would love to hear a little bit about you and your background and where did you start? What do you like, and how did you stumble upon this whole world of whole scale change management?
Awesome. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to spend time with Rupert. So thank you for the invitation and for having me be a part of season two. The simplest way to describe me is I'm a product of each generation, each decade sort of created a new set of learning. So in the 70s, I was an internal HR person at General Foods in new product development and was an incubator for the design of work. How do you design jobs and create this interface between humans and machines? It's sort of a side product of writing the job descriptions and helping to organize whatever the new product test market product would be. Remember the product Pop Rocks? Pop Rocks? Remember the candy that explodes in your mouth? So that's one of my products, right? We designed the factory that, the production line that made those things. And so in the 70s at General Foods and one other place, it was an incubator for how do you create work, align it to machines, and how do you work with the people who make the machines so they understand how to design those machines to augment with people. Right? So it was an incubator for that for the 70s. In the 80s, I had a client who said we need to go to Japan and study Japanese manufacturing. And so from the mid 80s until almost 1992, a couple times a year, I was taking Americans to Japan to study total quality, Japanese manufacturing, Hoshin planning, strategic thinking, and so integrating my sort of North American, this is how we do it with reconciling how the Japanese do it, was sort of the exploration of the 80s. And in the late 80s, I had a client who said, we're being asked as a part of total quality to, do things just in time, to reduce our cycle times, to get things to market faster with less. Why can't we reduce the cycle time on change? That was his question. Why does it have to, quote, take so long? And I thought, whenever I was asked as a young man, I would say, 2 to 3 years. But I had no real data for that. I just made it up. And so his question was, why does it have to take so long? And in that process in the late 80s, I was doing a lot of organization redesign, right? Old rust bucket factories and trying to create more participative workplaces. And the problem with it was that we empowered the few to decide for the many. We would create a design team, a small microcosm of the whole, and we would lock them up for 3, 4, 5 months and take them on a journey of recreating the workplace. And then it would take 6 months for them to convince their peers and colleagues about it. And so I thought, why do the few have to decide for the many? Why can't the many decide for themselves? Why do we have to take a small group on the journey? Why can't we take the whole system on the journey? And yeah, right. And so in the late 80s and the early 90s, I discovered this woman by the name of Kathy Dannemiller, who was one of the early pioneers in large group methods and large group interactive processes. And I wanted to go faster. She wanted to go deeper because mostly the work that she did was very high level strategic thinking stuff. but it wasn't impacting the day-to-day of the workforce and the work that people do. So her interest in going deeper and my interest in going faster combined us. So in the 90s, all these large group methods like whole scale change that we're here to talk about today, they came about. Um, in the 2000s, I actually quit because I was burned out. My wife and I started a wine business. I became an entrepreneur. I always thought consultants should put their money where their mouths are. Um, and then after the crisis in 2008, I came back to doing more of what I'd always been meant to do. Right. So that's, and so that's how I got to where I am today. Okay.
What an interesting journey. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Paul.
You're welcome.
And Paul, I hope we discussed beforehand, but you were on your year of lasts. And for those that aren't familiar with this term, I wasn't. So a year of last. So Paul is doing the last of everything this year from a work perspective. That there's nothing wrong with Paul's healthy and fit, but he's doing his year of lasts, and so this is probably going to be one of the last podcasts. And so I just think it's given us a year of lasts, and given that we've actually talked about stuff back to the 1970s, and we were sort of joking a little bit that all too often people write something, create something, put a podcast out there nowadays, maybe a TikTok something, and as if it's new thinking. Whereas it's been there for a long time, and it's quite interesting. You're talking about people interacting with machines and UX and technology. People are talking about that all the time, and AI, how that's augmenting work. And people talk about the future of work all the time. That was 5 years ago. So I'd love to unpack what are the things that you saw, back in the 70s and 80s that have been forgotten, that we shouldn't forget, that were effective. What are the things that people keep on going back to that didn't work, that has never worked? Because you also made the joke that, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, that's madness. Yet we keep on doing the same practices and expecting a different outcome, and 80% of change fails. That's a statistic that in my lifetime hasn't changed. I assume in your lifetime it's probably consistent as well.
Well, the place to start is everybody always uses the statistic that 70% of all change efforts fail, right? And when you unpack the failures, there's almost always the same reasons, right? The research on change says that there are two primary issues. There are multiple issues, but two primary. One is we go too slow, and so the next change overwhelms it, or we go so slow people don't really think it's going to happen, and so they lose momentum and energy. They become the valley of despair or something like that. And the other is engagement, right? Which my mentor Eric Trist discovered 70 years ago, that if you don't move quickly and if you don't engage people in the conversation, right, you're not likely to be successful. And so what strikes me is we keep repeating that mistake. We either want to pilot things, we want to move slowly, or the few decide for the many instead of enabling the many to decide for themselves. Right? Ownership and commitment comes from engagement, and so what strikes me is 40 years ago we were having that discussion, and today we're still having that discussion, and yet the data is there, right? If you want to be successful, here are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that you should do. That's number one, Rupert. The other is, in the 80s, we were preachy, self-management, self-organized. I would go to Japan and the Japanese managers would say, explain self-management to me. And so the managers would get up and pontificate about how much voice employees have. And the Japanese manager would almost always ask the question, well, could they stop making that product? Oh, no, 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 no. Could they decide to make something different? Oh, no, 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 no. Could they blah, blah, blah? Oh, no, 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 no. And so the Japanese would scratch their head and say, so exactly what is it that people are selfing about, right? And so it's, you know, we were preachy about, we wanted participative workplaces and all these other things, but the how to get there, how to embed it, how to sustain it, right? We didn't really pay much attention to. And I think we're making that same mistake again, right? People are preachy, whether it's Teal, corporate rebels, everybody's got this exciting view of what it should look like. But the question is, how do you take people on a journey to create what they would like it to look like, not what you think it should look like, right? And I think that's, what I learned in the 70s from Eric Trist was not to have the answer, but to do action learning and action research and to engage those who need the answer in discovering for themselves what it would be. When Eric would come to the plant that I was working at to make that candy, right? He never had a judgment about what it should look like. His way was engaging people in conversation, right, about what they aspire to and what they think would work best. And so he built ownership and commitment in the dialogue. Um, but I think today, we're preachy again. Instead of saying, how do we engage a whole system in a process that enables them to embrace what they collectively think is a good future? That's, the term whole scale, it's hyphenated, right? It's really two words. The whole is system, the whole system, right? Because if you don't take the whole system on the journey, the part that you leave behind is usually the one that will bite you in the butt, right? So it's holistic. And holism is everything from everybody, all of the employees, so large group methods and bringing big groups of people into the room. Certainly that's one way to be whole, right? But whole is also aligning the processes, the structures, right? The tools and the methods and everything else. So both of those things, it's both the human and the technical, right? And the scale is sometimes you're large scale and sometimes you're small scale. Sometimes it makes more sense to engage a few to create possibilities that the many can choose from, right? Because you can't create what you can't imagine. And so you need some ways to create imagination, right? So maybe that's a small group doing that. So the scale is both large and small, right? It's always whole, especially in today's world because of the complexities and everything. But the scale can be big or little, and in today's world, what we did in the 90s with large group methods and hundreds of people in the room at the same time, that doesn't happen much anymore, right? You might get 1,000 people virtually on a jam, for a large whole system conversation. Certainly a lot of companies do that, but the notion of bringing 1,000 people into a room to collectively create their new reality, that's not likely to happen very much anymore, right? So, so the scale has changed, right? But the whole part of it still is important. So when I think about where we've been and where we are, that's I said I wrote this article called I'm working on this article called "Deja Vu All Over Again," right? What the past can teach us about the future, and it's a case study of a 40-year-old high performance workplace. And the reason why I bring it up is because I want to make one more distinction. And so this place is the longest lived, I believe, high performance, self-managed workplace in North America. It was designed that way. It was created that way. There are 1,000 people today. 100 people call themselves something other than a worker. They're an engineer. They're a technical support. There's a senior leadership team, but they don't really do much other than act as sort of the gyroscope to keep the culture on track. But the difference is, I was reminded of when we were working on this article, that when we talk about self hyphen, there's a difference between self-organizing, self-managing, and self-governing. Right? Self-organizing is about vertical loading. Horizontal loading. How do you combine all the tasks and the activities and the work to create something that people would wake up in the morning excited about going to? Self-managing is about horizontal loading. How do they make decisions? How do they operate? How do they decide things like pay scales and wages, and who does the hiring, and the things that would be traditionally salaried employee manager kind of work, right? And then there's self-governing, which is about setting the strategy, the direction, right? Getting out to the customer, selling the business. This plant went from one product 40 years ago to 15 products today, right? From 1,000 man hours for getting something done to 100 man hours for getting something done. And they manage the business of the business. So they organize the work of the work, and they manage the business of the business, right? Which in today's world, we don't really talk about self-governing. We talk about self-organizing, sure. Maybe we talk about self-managing, but there are very few self-governing systems where people actually can choose for themselves. Maybe a couple cooperatives like Mondragon and in Spain, and maybe a few others, but not many.
It's fascinating. And so a lot of references about how people haven't learned. Why? Like, you say the data's been there for such a long time. 2 reasons, pretty self-evident. Why is it that is it just too difficult for us? Does it fall in the too hard bucket? Is it that leaders feel they need to have all the answers and come with the answers, and that's innate in the people who are leaders, and therefore it's a trap of ego? I'd love to know your perspective.
No, it's a good question. I think, my first reaction to your question is, when you look at the issue of speed, right? The leaders are minimalists. Right? If you say it takes 2 weeks, they say make it happen in a week. You say it takes 6 months, they say make it 3. So they want to go faster, right? But the price of sometimes you have to go slower to go faster. That's the engagement part of it, right? Sometimes you have to go slower to go faster, and so this relationship between speed and engagement, right? And the dynamic tension between them is difficult. I can do both simultaneously using whole scale change and the way in which I engage a system. I can move you fast and deep. That's what Dan Miller and I were trying to do. We were trying to figure out how to do that. I think I know I can move faster than you want to move, actually. But the price you're going to pay is you need to engage the system. And that's risky because you can't control the outcome. It's like an open space meeting. You invite 50 people, who knows what might come of that conversation, and so, so there's a little bit of letting go of the final
Yeah, I was about
solutions.
to ask, is it a letting go control
Mm-hmm.
issue? Like, I know I want to go there to point
Yeah.
B,
Yeah.
and goodness me, we might end up agreeing that, what, it's point C, and actually I might, as the leader, not be comfortable with. I want to go to B, and so the leader has to be open to that, which
Yep.
I'm
Yep.
most will not be, and that
Yeah.
probably doesn't change much over time, because humans are humans, and we don't evolve that quickly, right? It takes hundreds of thousands of years.
The other thing you triggered is this sort of speed is about time. And I have and the I was reminded in the session that I did yesterday with my two colleagues who were working on the article with me, that there's a flip side to that coin. Right? What has enabled this facility, this GE facility in Canada, to survive is that they invest a huge amount of time in training. Right? Huge amount of time in training. And the lesson was you can't stop doing that. The moment you stop doing that, the system begins to atrophy. Right? And so there is this time dimension, whether it's going fast or going slow, right? And in this plant, 20% of people's time is spent in training. Training could be as a part of a committee to make strategic decisions about the business. They run their own goal sharing, gain sharing program. They monitor salaries. They do salary surveys every year. 20% of their time is invested in learning, whether it's in
Is it
doing
learning or
something.
learning and reflection? So reflective time,
Well,
or is it learning? 'Cause maybe I'm old fashioned in what I'm thinking about learning. Like
no,
I'm trying to understand what you mean by learning. If I'm sitting here working on,
well, learning is in their world. Learning is discovering new ways. Learning is
was generating the
learning.
learning as well as
Yeah, yeah.
being taught.
It's
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's and in their world, learning is about the work of the work, right? How do you
Hmm.
make this product in the right way? And it's gone from and then, and a lot of learning for them is about embracing technology and leveraging and augmenting technologies to
Hmm.
support what they're trying to do. A lot of learning is about the business of the business, the
Hmm.
economics of the business, right? Looking at the competition and what competitors do. So learning is sort of multiple levels, right?
Yeah.
It's how
Mhm.
I do my day to day, but it's also how do I strategically place us in a place where
We
nobody's
can be
ever going to mess
successful
with us,
tomorrow, and not
Yeah.
yeah, keeping
So
right?
the
learning about the whole system, not just about individual. Like I'm not
Right,
learning
right.
to enhance my skill set, but I'm learning to enhance the whole system together.
Because we're self-governing, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to know what that means, right? And we need to know the consequences of choices and decisions that we might make.
Right.
So in the article, Rupert, we say they don't really separate learning from doing, right?
mm.
Because
Well,
in the
yeah,
act
very
of
interesting.
doing, yeah, yeah,
Is
We're
in
learning,
learning.
we're improving. But this is
right,
that. I mean, I guess back to your time in Japan, the whole lean thinking actually was a learning process because every
Right.
time you'd say, well, how do we make this better? And on the process line, and anyone could stop the line from moving because they thought it was
yep,
going to be. And
yep,
so a lot of those concepts, I guess that you're talking about, were there in the 1980s that led to total quality management was exactly that, a learning process, and everyone's thinking the whole time. And you have a meeting. I learned when I was at Carney what went well, even better if, and you do that after every
mm,
meeting. You do that after every. So that's constantly reflecting and improving things. Um,
And that's
I,
also a
I
foundation for agile ways of working now.
exactly.
yeah.
Hmm.
Exactly. And I mean, you don't go from 1,000 man hours to make a product to 100 man hours without continuous improvement and continuous learning and integrating new technologies and new ways of thinking and working. Right? They pride themselves in their ability to do that. Um, and and largely it's because they're making the decisions for the business. It's not somebody telling them we need to do this. It's them discovering it for themselves in their interactions with their customers, their suppliers, right? And looking at their competitors and things like that. And so they've developed that kind of mindset and that kind of culture. It was an interesting discussion about time, Rupert, because in one sense we said you need to move fast. In the other sense, we said, but you need to take the time to educate people, to train people, you know, um, literally they spend one day a week in meetings that are non-product delivery
Yeah.
oriented.
But this is the sharp and the saw parable. The person's
Yes.
busy cutting the tree, and you know he's like, "Stop! no, I can't. I've got to cut the tree down, and I take the saw out, sharpen it. Now we can, and it's just that, isn't it? I think, it's probably, is it as simple as that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and in whole scale change, we always talked about critical mass, right? How do you build critical mass, you know, um, across a microcosm of the organization so that you see all the perspectives and all the points of view, all the levels, all the functions, all the history, all the experience. In this plant with the generational shift, the new generation is saying, why the hell do we have to do it that way? I wasn't there when you made that decision. So how do I get involved in making the decision in a way that I can now embrace it, right? And so the transitioning from the old to the new is a little bit of the old explaining the why, and then having a conversation about, is that still operationally, the way we're operationalizing that why, is it still the best way? First, do we agree with the principle, right? The why, right? And if that principle still speaks to us, then maybe generationally there's a different way to do it, right? But sort of how do you build that ownership and commitment over time? And so there's a lot of discussion about facilities that have been successful have continued to invest the time to ensure that the mindsets are there, the culture's there, the knowledge is there. Others have trained the first generation immensely, the second generation a little, the third generation not at all. And the third generation says, well, why the hell do we have to do it that way? And they don't have all of that continuity, right, in that history, right? Whole scale change, we always talked about critical mass, constellations of stakeholders, um, convergence, right? The reality is in every system, you begin with divergent thinking. Everybody's got their opinion, right? Leaders have their opinion. Nobody's opinion is any better than anybody else's opinion. And the question becomes, how do we take all that divergent thinking and leverage it to create something convergent that we could all,
Align around.
yeah, be wowed about. Yeah,
Be
exactly.
wild about.
Yeah.
Even
Yep.
better, be
Yep.
wild about. I prefer
Yep.
that than
Yep. Yeah,
be wild.
actually, I mean,
Be motivated and crazy. Like,
Yes.
yes, be
Yes.
wild about. I like that. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, Paul. We could go on forever, I think. And hopefully when you're in London in June, we can have a glass of wine
that'd be awesome.
and continue. But we like to wrap up with two T's. So I'll start with the first one. Tool one. Now you're going to have a million tools. This is going to be hard for you to pick, but one tool, one practical thing that our listeners could take away and apply, that you've applied, that you think would be helpful for them to think about, and then I'll let Shradha take us home with the last T and wrap us up.
I think I think for me, it's the wisdom's in the system. The wisdom's in the system. If you don't believe that, you're dead in the water. And I mean, I've never worked with an organization where people weren't smart, bright, interested in doing good things, and would wow you, right, with their wisdom. So you have to trust that the wisdom is in the system. If you hire good people, they'll give them voice. The wisdom's in the system. I think that's the number one.
That's
Oh, that's
great.
nice.
And I would say that it's also a check that if as a leader I don't feel the trust and the wisdom of the system, then there is a problem. And I need to
Yeah.
fundamentally correct something. So that goes to our second T, Paul, which is the trap. What is one trap that you feel that we all fall into and we can avoid easily?
The I think the biggest trap, as I see it in the moment, is what I think the word I used earlier, which is preachy, preachy, preachy. The trap is thinking that you have the answer, or thinking maybe that your answer is better than somebody else's answer. There's a lot of people out there preaching the end in mind, which is a beautiful end in mind. I don't disagree with it. but it's their end in mind, not the people who have to live it and breathe it and do it every day, And so mine would be get off your pedestal and stop preaching and start asking people what the hell it is that they want and create the conditions in which they can achieve that. That's the trap.
Nice one. That's a trap. It's a very easy trap. It's a very
I agree with that. Rupert and I were talking about it some time back that we all are saying these days that HR should be bold. How do we make that? Right? Like, let's start thinking about how to get us there rather than just saying, yes, we should be bold, because just by saying we can't be. So I agree with that.
It's double and triple loop learning. It's iterating your way to the future. It's giving voice to those who are impacted. Right. Yeah.
amazing.
Fantastic. Paul, as Rupert said, we can continue to go on talking, and hopefully we can continue our conversations off the podcast, because this is your year of last. So we are very fortunate that we grab hold of you, and you were very kind to give your appearance. So thank you so much for
You're
your
welcome.
wisdom, for your time, and for all your experiences.
Really,
You're
thank
welcome.
you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take
Bye,
care,
everybody.
everybody. Bye. Until next time.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.